For background in user timing level one, they had a recommended mark name section. I pasted it here, but basically sites could mark when they were fully loaded, fully visible, above the fold, and the time to user interaction. And back in those days, like events like page load, which were kind of used for generic measurement of these things, didn't fit all the cases. And we still do think, even with Core Web Vitals, that there's going to be like a lot of product specific cases that sites will always want. I mean, that's why we have user timing in the first place. They'll always want to have their own points to track. So some things that the reason we've been looking into it in Chrome is because there are a lot of sites that would like to tell us like specific points in the page load where like a very large JavaScript has finished and things like that help us optimize. But we thought this might be useful for other use cases like RUM analytics, large platforms that have to monitor a lot of sites, and automated testing tools. So we were wondering if anybody knew why it was removed after level one, and whether they thought that bringing something like this might be useful for their use cases.
So I have vague memories of the history of this, and I believe they were removed just for lack of usage. I think there was either some telemetry data that was gathered from the Chrome team way back in the day, or one of the RUM providers looked at it and we just saw like extremely little use cases of it. And then once we moved to level 2, it was just a question of, should we continue bringing this forward, or is it just kind of extra verbiage in the spec? And then so I think it was just essentially dropped at the time.
That's interesting. I did do a study about a year ago in HTTP Archive, and not all of them are heavily used, but about 6,000 sites used mark fully loaded.
Yeah. From a RUM provider point of view, I was always in favor of keeping them in just because I felt like it could be a useful thing for us to standardize around and mark in similar ways, and dev tools and RUM and stuff like that. We don't do anything special with them today in our RUM product because very little usage. But we show regular user timing marks. But if there are these golden ones, these special ones that people use more, I'm sure that we would incorporate them in.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Michael?
So one that isn't on the list, although the fourth one was similar maybe, which might be interesting to add, which is something like mark time to interactive. So there is a metric called time to interactive, which has a sort of browser defined, somewhat artificial definition, but I know that a lot of sites are working to optimize the way they define interactive. So maybe there's like a fallback until hydration completes, and then you have a more interactive mode or something like that. So that would be an interesting time point, because I know it's like a hot topic of competition and optimization right now, and it would be interesting to see that. I'm glad Dan is willing to share there.
No, all I wanted to say is actually kind of contrary to that, is that rather than trying to name what are likely different things using the same name, if we determine that something is universally useful, maybe it should be have an implementation, a standard implementation or definition of measurement.
And my team works very, very hard on exactly that, right? Like a standard implementation of measurement. But years into the Core Web Vitals program, we are still seeing, like, from internal performance teams at Google, like the V8 team, for example, they really want to know, like, exactly this point in time that it kind of makes sense as a topic, like when can somebody edit a Google Doc or something like that. But it's not necessarily like some pages don't have the concept at the same time.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that once we start using standard names or standardized names, but don't standardize meanings, it seems problematic to me.
What problems do you think could come out of that?
Simply the fact that different implementations, or very wildly different calculations, would use the same names. And if and you're kind of standardizing something that isn't standardized. to an extent. You know, how do they say that? Like the two biggest problems in computer science, naming things, caching, and off by one errors. So you know, you're kind of naming things without specifying what these things are. But you know, that's the issue that I see. Nothing beyond that.
Thanks. I think Pat's next in the queue. Sorry, I'll open it up. Pat, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. I think part of that can be avoided and I don't know that we necessarily want to have like time to X, but like not just the naming, but the description beyond, like mark app is useful, or first app is first useful, or something like that. As long as they're reasonably scoped. I don't know that you'd ever want to necessarily use these as comparisons for like site A versus site B, but within the scope of a given site, or selfishly on the browser side, if at scale we want to optimize for metrics and we say, hey, if you instrument the things you care about, we will try our darndest not to regress them or even improve them if we can. If you mark things that you don't care about as if you cared about them, well, sorry. I'd encourage thinking about this beyond just performance, though. It'd be really nice if we could start to get into things like user engaged, or user did something that I consider a business useful metric, in some way that we can start correlating performance and business metrics and optimizing for both rather than just one.
Yeah, and I do think it's really interesting that all those years ago, mark time to user interaction was something that they were thinking about. Nick?
Yeah, what Pat just said really resonates with me. Bringing it outside of just the performance focus, obviously having something like that can give indicators to a RUM system that something that happened was interesting or important to the site in a standard way that we could key off of, or take an action, or measure more, or report on, or something like that. I think I understand Dan's concern around these being undefined intentionally, almost. I think as long as there's no carrots associated with how fast these are, then it's okay, right? Like, I'm assuming the major search engines aren't going to prioritize this just because you've marked fully loaded at 0 milliseconds. But that is certainly a consideration here, is making sure that these are intentionally left vague, almost intentionally not comparable across sites, usable by somebody that wants within a site for any tools that they're using to automatically key off of, DevTools or RUM or what have you. Yeah, the whole conversation here is very interesting, because I was part of the original user timing spec design, and we thought back in 2010, like, oh, this would be fantastic. Everybody is going to use these. It'd be great if we all standardized around them. And unfortunately, we just didn't see that usage back then. Now, way back then, before user timing was a thing, and it's certainly picked up a lot since then. So I am in favor of this. It's just interesting how it's circling around.
Yeah. Anything else? All right. Thanks, everybody. It's very helpful.
Cheers. Oh, I forgot to cut on the recording. I will